They said a black man could never do it. They said his hands were unfit for precision, his mind unfit for complexity, and his place in life far below the machinery that kept a nation alive. But in 1943, inside a roaring factory in Detroit, a young engineer named David Baker stepped in front of a blueprint that would change the course of the war and his life. Not because the country believed in him, but because it desperately needed what only he could give. David's life began far from the industrial north, long before the roar of assembly lines and the shadow of war. He was born in 1915 in Birmingham, Alabama, a place where opportunity was rationed by race and where black ambition was treated like a threat. The streets were dusty, the summers unforgiving, and the rules of segregation etched into every corner of daily life. His father worked the fields from sunrise to dark, hands cracked and shoulders bent under the weight of labor that never promised a future. His mother, despite earning barely enough to survive, taught in a one-room schoolhouse where the roof leaked when it rained and the stove smoked when it tried to keep the children warm. Yet every day she stood at the front of that classroom, teaching children who had been told they were worth nothing. And each night she returned home and fought to keep her own son's imagination alive. She believed that learning was the one weapon the world couldn't take away, so she taught David math by candlelight long after the rest of the town had fallen silent. Numbers, she told him, belonged to everyone. No law could segregate the laws of physics. No color line could change how a lever worked or how gears turned. And so the tiny kitchen table became his first laboratory, illuminated by a flickering flame and his mother's unshakable faith. While other children played in the dirt or chased each other across the fields, David spent his hours hunched over pocket watches he had taken apart just to see how their delicate hearts ticked. He collected broken radios from neighbors, coaxing them back to life with improvised tools and a growing sense of wonder. He sketched machines he imagined could exist someday, contraptions with impossible shapes, engines with improved efficiency, systems no one around him could fully understand. His father watched him with a complicated mix of pride and fear. Pride because he knew brilliance when he saw it. Fear because he understood the world outside their home, how it punished black children who dared to dream too high, who dared to step beyond the invisible boundaries drawn to contain them. He warned David gently, cautiously, urging him to be careful, to stay small, to avoid drawing the wrong kind of attention. But deep down, he knew it was useless. The boy's mind was already reaching beyond Birmingham's red clay roads, chasing problems he had no books to read about, solving puzzles no one had assigned him. David wasn't just clever. He was driven, curious, relentless. Even as a child, it was clear that the world would have to work hard to keep up with him. And that, his father feared, was the most dangerous truth of all. The signs of segregation surrounded them every day. Separate schools, separate everything, and unwritten rules that kept black talent locked away where it couldn't threaten the white world. Every time David passed the local machine shop and watched white men shape steel into beautiful, functional designs, a simple question rose in him. Why not me? He found his answer in 1933 when he earned a scholarship to the Tuskegee Institute, one of the few places where a black student could study engineering. Surrounded by peers who refused to settle for the limits imposed on them, David finally felt free to explore the full depth of his abilities. His nights stretched into early mornings as he worked through equations, filled notebooks, and studied machinery with an intuitive understanding that amazed his professors. Many believed he was one of the most promising engineering minds of his generation. He graduated in 1937 with top honors and a crushing realization. America's engineering firms didn't want him. He applied to Ford, General Motors, Westinghouse, General Electric. The rejection letters came one after another. A few were polite, others weren't. Some stated plainly, "We do not hire colored engineers." One suggested he consider janitorial work. David saved every letter in a box under his bed. Each night he read them, not to torment himself but to fuel a promise. One day he would create something so essential that the world couldn't ignore it. He never imagined the opportunity would come through a global catastrophe. When the attack on Pearl Harbor thrust the United States into World War II, the nation faced a crisis. It needed machines, tanks, ships, and above all, planes. And it needed them at a pace the world had never seen. Detroit's factories transformed almost overnight into massive war production plants. The largest of them all was Willow Run, designed to build B-24 Liberator bombers at the impossible rate of one plane every hour. The sheer scale of the operation forced companies to break racial barriers they had long defended. Black workers weren't admitted out of fairness. They were admitted because the war machine needed bodies and brains, and white America alone couldn't supply them. David arrived at Willow Run in early 1943. The factory was overwhelming, nearly a mile long, filled with the constant grind of metal, the clatter of tools, the heat of welding torches, and the tension of failure. Production was behind schedule. Critical parts weren't working. Planes were rolling out late, or not at all, and soldiers overseas were dying because support wasn't reaching them fast enough. David was hired as a technical assistant, not an engineer. The title was intentional. It meant carrying tools, following orders, and never being trusted with real design decisions. Segregation followed him into the workplace. Separate bathrooms, separate lunch tables, separate expectations. On his first day, a foreman named Sullivan tossed him a blueprint, almost as a test, and told him to file it. It was a complicated hydraulic actuator design requiring extremely tight tolerances. David noticed within minutes that the part would fail under stress. He knew speaking up could get him fired, but he also knew that staying silent could cost pilots their lives. So he approached Sullivan and carefully explained the error. The room went quiet. After a long pause, Sullivan checked the math, compared the designs, and finally nodded. They manufactured both versions and tested them. The original design shattered under pressure. David's held firm. It didn't erase racism from the plant. But in that moment, David gained something few black workers were allowed: credibility. Word spread quickly. Soon, white engineers were bringing him their unsolved problems. Quietly, discreetly. They took his solutions and presented them as their own. Official documents never carried his name, but David cared more about the work than the recognition. In March 1943, the B-24 faced a catastrophic issue. Its landing gear was failing in combat conditions. Planes were collapsing during landings. Pilots were dying. Investigations pointed to flaws in the gear mechanism itself, but no one could find a solution. David studied the problem from the sidelines, unnoticed. He realized the failure wasn't in the mechanical structure, it was in the hydraulic system deploying it. Under extreme cold, heat, vibration, and battle damage, the hydraulic fluid lost pressure. The landing gear wasn't deploying properly, not because the gear was weak, but because the system powering it was breaking down. David spent nights alone in the segregated dormitory, rebuilding the entire hydraulic system on paper. He added redundancies, redesigned routing to protect against enemy fire, and recommended a different fluid better suited to the range of battlefield conditions. It was an audacious overhaul, something even senior engineers might hesitate to suggest. When he brought his findings to Sullivan, he expected dismissal. Instead, Sullivan sent him straight to the chief engineer. Soon, David was standing in a conference room surrounded by white engineers and military officers who didn't believe he could possibly have done the work himself. One colonel openly questioned whether he'd copied it, but the chief engineer asked a simple question: "Can you defend your design?" David did, clearly, calmly, and without hesitation. For 2 hours, he walked them through every calculation until the evidence spoke louder than prejudice. The redesigned system was tested. It worked flawlessly. Within weeks, the Baker hydraulic system was implemented across all B-24 bombers, though not under his name. Every plane leaving the factory from then on carried his unseen signature. His design saved countless crews who otherwise would have died in fiery landings. It kept damaged bombers functional long enough to return home. It gave the Allies a more dependable aircraft during some of the war's most brutal campaigns. But the official record credited the engineering department. David's name never appeared. Once he proved himself indispensable, he became the unofficial problem solver for countless issues: reducing engine mount vibrations, improving the bomb bay door reliability, preventing oxygen system freeze-ups, strengthening rivet patterns, solving bearing failures and metal fatigue. Each fix improved the B-24 in ways that saved lives, yet none of those improvements ever bore his name. In the break rooms and machine bays of Willow Run, Black workers whispered about him the way soldiers talk about legends, quietly, respectfully, knowing full well what it meant to excel in a place determined not to see you. They heard about the hydraulic calculations he solved when senior engineers shrugged. They saw how test pilots returned with grateful smiles, unaware that the man who had prevented their deaths wasn't even allowed to sit in the engineering office. To those workers, David became something rare, a living symbol, proof that brilliance didn't depend on permission, proof that even inside a segregated, hostile wartime plant, a black man could carry an entire bomber program on his shoulders without ever being acknowledged. Young mechanics and draftsmen watched him closely. They studied not just his engineering shortcuts and diagnostic tricks, but the way he moved, calm, humble, precise. A man who understood the weight of being invisible and still did the work anyway. Then came June 1944, D-Day. The skies over Normandy roared with the thunder of B-24 Liberators, hundreds of them, flying low over choppy seas and fortified beaches. Inside those bombers were soldiers who had no idea that a man they would never meet had redesigned the mechanisms that kept their landing gear from collapsing on takeoff. No pilot knew why their fuel systems performed better under stress. No bombardier understood whose quiet brilliance allowed their plane to absorb more damage before failing. But the evidence, undeniable, powerful, was stitched across the skies of France. By the end of the war, Willow Run had produced over 80,600 Liberators, each one built from sweat, steel, and the uncredited genius of men like David. His work wasn't in the manuals, it wasn't in the reports, it was in the planes themselves, the ones that limped home riddled with flak holes, their systems still functioning against all odds. When victory in Europe and the Pacific was finally declared, the plant began to slow. Hours were cut, production lines shut down, and as always, black workers were the first to be dismissed. David received his termination letter in September 1945, a thin envelope, a single paragraph. It thanked him for his service as a technical assistant and offered 2 weeks' pay. There was no mention of the hydraulic breakthrough that saved pilots' lives. No mention of the redesigns the engineering team leaned on for years. No recognition at all. Just silence, exactly what history had always reserved for men like him. On his final day, Sullivan approached him awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. "You're the best engineer I ever worked with," he admitted. "I'm sorry this is how it ends." It was the only acknowledgement David ever received from inside the factory. David tried to build an engineering career after the war, but the cycle repeated. Companies rejected him. His wartime achievements were uncredited. He had no way to prove the designs were his. Eventually, he became a high school math and physics teacher in Detroit. He poured his knowledge into the next generation, teaching black students that their minds were capable of anything, even if society tried to stop them. He lived a quiet life after the war, almost as if fading into the background was something he had been trained for. By day, David worked modest jobs, repair work, tutoring, odd technical tasks that never asked too much of his mind. But by night, the old spark returned. He sat at his kitchen table with engineering books stacked around him like old friends, sketching ideas for machines that would never be built, improvements no factory would ever consider, systems that existed only on the pages he filled with careful pencil strokes. Sometimes he caught himself wondering, never bitterly, just softly, what he could have achieved if America had allowed him the career he had long since earned. If the door to engineering had opened for him the way it opened for men he trained in silence, if the world had seen what he had given it. David Baker died in 1983 at the age of 68. His obituary, printed in a small local paper, described him as a teacher, a church volunteer, a community figure. It painted the picture of a gentle man who gave back to those around him. But the obituary never mentioned Willow Run. It never mentioned the B-24 Liberator or the hydraulic redesign that kept hundreds of aircraft from collapsing under strain. It never mentioned that he once solved problems the U.S. Army Air Forces couldn't fix. His name never entered the official record. His contributions were never cataloged, never archived, never written into the engineering history of World War II aviation. And yet, his fingerprints remain there, hidden beneath steel and rivets. But David's story reveals something larger, something painful. He wasn't alone. He was one of countless Black Americans whose ideas, calculations, and craft shaped the war effort, but were buried under segregation, stripped of authorship, and left to disappear from memory. They built engines, tested weapons, refined assembly lines, improved machinery, and then were dismissed without acknowledgement. The B-24 helped win World War II, not because America had defeated racism, but because necessity forced open doors that had been locked for generations. Factories needed labor. Engineering teams needed answers. And for a brief moment, skill outweighed prejudice. But when the war ended, recognition never followed. Those doors shut just as quickly as they had opened. David Baker should have been celebrated as one of the great engineering minds of his generation. He should have led design teams, filed patents, spoken at conferences, and mentored the young engineers who came after him. He should have walked through aviation museums and seen plaques bearing his name. Instead, he was quietly pushed aside once the country no longer needed him. And yet, his legacy endured, not in textbooks, not in press releases, but in the survival stories of pilots who came home alive because his math was right. In aircraft that returned from Europe riddled with flak holes, their systems still functioning because he had the courage to challenge the designs others accepted without question. His life proved an undeniable truth. Genius has no color, talent needs no permission, and brilliance survives even when history tries to erase it. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose names were never meant to be known.